Okay, great. It's 12 o'clock. Good day, everyone. Not sure if it's the same time zone for everyone, but wherever you are, I'd like to greet you. My name is Asel Kaderbaeva. I'm the Knowledge and Innovation Manager of EASPD, and I'm joining you today from Brussels, from my home, as we're all working from home, well, most of us. So welcome to this workshop number 6 on the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education. We have a really interesting program and even better speakers. But before proceeding, I would like to just go through some practical points to go through Zoom and introduce you to housekeeping information. I think most of you, all of you already know, you've been at previous work panels, you know how to use Zoom. Just would like to ask you to keep muted unless you're speaking. You can do it by using this microphone sign on Zoom. You can switch on or off your videos. Of course, it's always nice to see faces. So if you're fine with it, you're comfortable with it, please turn on your videos so that it can be a bit more interactive. Use the chat box. You will see the sign as well to ask your questions. Please feel free to ask during the intervention so we can get back to your questions later on. Sometimes it's nice to write it down, not to forget, because as information keeps coming, it's sometimes it happens that you forget your questions. So just in case, feel free to use it. This session is being recorded so that you are aware of it. And there is live captioning. So you can turn it on by clicking on the icon that says CC, live transcript. And one of the other features of Zoom is, of course, the reactions button. I really encourage you to use it as well, since we have it, and I think it makes it a bit more lively. So if there is something you like or you agree with, use the thumbs up or hearts or claps. So I will be happy to see some reactions from you as well to help our speakers with their presentation. I think it's always nice because since we are not seeing each other live, at least this helps us to be a bit closer together. So yeah, if I see a lot of hearts, it warms my heart as well. But in moving on, so we have our workshop. It will last 1 hour. We have a presentation that is prepared by our speakers, whom I will introduce shortly. And towards the end of it, we'll have some time for questions as well. So if you would like, as I mentioned, put your questions in the chat box, that's great. But also at the end, if you would like to ask a question with your voice, you can unmute yourself, raise your hand, and then unmute yourself to ask your question. And let's keep it interactive. So that's it for the practical things. Now I would like to move on to the topic of today's workshop, that is the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education. Before starting, maybe just let's take a step back and reflect, all of us, about what is the quality of our life, how we assess it today. I hope it's at on the positive side. But it's a very complex, multidimensional issue, and I'm really happy today to have top class experts to talk through the quality of life model, the framework for inclusive education that they have developed as part of the Erasmus Plus funded project called QoLI-IE Plus, Inclusive Education Plus. And I would like to introduce to you the two speakers that we have today. Perhaps if you are here, you already knew a bit about quality of life, and then if you talk about this, perhaps one first speaker doesn't need a lot of introduction. We have Miguel Angel Verdugo with us. Even though many of you have heard of him and knew about him, he's the professor at the University of Salamanca and director and the founder of the Institute on Community Integration, as well as the director of the master's degree on integration of people with disabilities, quality of life. He has published over 500 scientific papers and contributed to a lot of books, and wrote a lot of books. He's the author who is quite well known, especially in our field. And together with him, we have Antonio Manuel Amor Gonzalez. He's also a professor at the University of Salamanca, and he's been working on the topic of inclusion of persons with disabilities. Maybe you in the bios have also read that his PhD dissertation was awarded the Royal Academy of Doctors of Spain as the best dissertation defended in Spain 2 years ago. So as I said, top class speakers today, and I would like to give the floor to them already. So we are all, all ears, as you say. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, with such presentation, now it's gonna be difficult to perform well. So let's gonna give our best. Now I'm gonna proceed to share the presentation, and I will start with our topic. Let's see. Okay, I hope that you can see it well. Well, hello everybody. And thank you for
just a second, if you could make, yeah, great. So now it's full screen. Thank you.
Yeah, now okay. Is my laptop needs some time. It's like me sometimes. Okay,
it's
hello everybody.
Now.
Okay, first of all, we would like to thank the attendants for being here and for providing us the opportunity to participate in this conference. The goal of our workshop is to present the Quality of Life Index as a resource to monitor inclusive education for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities regarding all the 4 goals of the Article 24 of the UN-CRPD, which are access, participation, learning, and development of students to their fullest potential. According to the UN-CRPD, providing students with personal outcomes linked to all these 4 goals is essential to achieve their full inclusion beyond school age. In a nutshell, inclusive education is the anteroom to their effective inclusion in the society in their adult stage, for example, regarding employment. And quality of life, as we will discuss, is a framework that can help schools to put the focus on all the relevant life domains of students with IDD so that they can achieve the true development of their fullest potential and contribute with active roles as adults in the 21st century democratic societies. However, prior to presenting this resource, which is publicly available at the ESPD website, or that at least it will be publicly available soon, we will present to the audience a couple of critical questions. These questions are: why to monitor inclusive education? In other words, why to put ourselves in front of the mirror of inclusive education, and how to monitor inclusive education. This critical question is the most important one. The answer may seem simple, right? To know the extent to which we are making progress in the path towards inclusion. We will address this last question presenting the Index for Inclusion. We have decided so because the index is perhaps the world's best known resource to monitor the extent to which a school is inclusive with students. Another reason to start with this point is to anchor our presentation to that provided yesterday by Tony Booth, one of the authors of the index. Presenting the index for inclusion as an example of tool to monitor inclusive education will help us to reach the two goals of our presentation today. First, to provide the rationale of adopting a quality of life framework for monitoring purposes by presenting what a quality of life approach brings new to complement and go beyond the proposals of the Index for Inclusion. And second, to help the audience understand the use of the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education as a tool, because it is based on the implementation of the Index for Inclusion. We will finally present the process we are following in Spain to develop a quality of life index for inclusive education with evidences of validity and reliability following a quantitative approach, and that part of the presentation will be presented by the leading researcher, who is Professor Verdugo. So let's gonna start. Okay, talking about inclusive education means to talk about a right recognized for students with IDD since the UN-CRPD was passed. According to the UN-CRPD's Article 24, inclusive education must put the focus not only in the academic achievement and beyond access, participation, and learning, it must ensure the development of students with IDD to their fullest potential. Okay, I think that we all here share this right and this value. The logical question that now rises is, how do we know if we are advancing or not in the path towards inclusive education? In which elements do we have to put the focus to assess if we are advancing in the path to inclusion? What is not defined cannot be measured, and what is not measured cannot be improved. This statement can help to understand the need to assess and monitor inclusive education. The question is that inclusive education is not only a right, but it also implies adopting a commitment to action within the education process. Inclusive education brings into action a set of values that are reflected in the way that each school conceives their students with IDD and offers them opportunities to enhance their access, participation, learning, and development. Therefore, given that inclusive education is an ongoing process aimed at specific goals, it is necessary to gather evidence about the extent to which the actions implemented are making the school advance successfully towards the aforementioned inclusive education goals. In addition, inclusive education monitoring is important given two reasons that help us to better understand the statement with which we started this slide. First, motivation. Monitoring highlights the responsibilities of the different stakeholders, which sometimes motivates them to action. And second, monitoring gives us effective feedback, allowing us early identification of problems and barriers in the implementation of inclusive education. This is essential to adopt measures that transform these barriers into facilitators and drivers of change. Before moving on to understand how to monitor inclusive education and present the index for inclusion, it is necessary to clarify what we mean when we say that inclusive education must be monitored. The assessment of inclusive education does not have to be understood in terms of success or failure. Inclusive education is a process and therefore it has no end. For this reason, there will never be a school that can claim itself as fully inclusive since reality changes and what we are doing in a certain situation to include students may not be effective in another. Hence, inclusion and monitoring require us to work continuously. For this reason, inclusive education evaluation must follow a formative and functional strategy. The formative or functional assessment, as you can see in the slide, is that in which the evidence gathered is used to learn from what we are doing right or wrong to act accordingly to improve our actions. The formative assessment is therefore necessary to learn from ourselves to advance in the inclusion of students with IDD. The figure you see in this slide represents a formative assessment approach. First, it is necessary to adopt a framework of assessment that I will address from the next slide. Second, we must put ourselves in front of that framework to see what we are doing good or wrong. Once we have all the relevant information, it is necessary to establish priorities of action. And finally, it will always be necessary to start again this never-ending process. Now, how to monitor inclusive education? To answer this question, one needs to focus on two critical aspects. First, the variables to monitor, and second, the process to monitor them and what to do with the information collected. As we said before, we will present the index as an example that brings these two elements together, and after that, we'll present what quality of life can offer to improve the reflection process given by the index. Monitoring must respond to a plan strategy to be as efficient as possible. The starting point must be to define the variables that will be monitored. Focusing the assessment of inclusive education on the whole education system of a given country would not be very operational for making changes happen and improving inclusive education. This is so because each school and its educational community are unique. Therefore, trying to monitor inclusive education regarding the whole education system will not be sensitive to each reality. To be operational, inclusive education monitoring must be focused on school level. According to Booth and Ainscoe, the essential elements that help us understand the extent to which a school works towards inclusive education are its educational culture, policies, and practices. The ongoing reflection and evidence gathering on this variable is what will put each school in front of the mirror of inclusive education, allowing schools to organize the changes they must face in their task of including students, diverse learners, including, in this case, students with intellectual disabilities. Before offering as a resource the Index for Inclusion to monitor educational culture, policies, and practices, and to support decision-making based on the information collected, it is necessary to define each variable and to understand the relationships among them. Cultures refers to the values, beliefs, and principles shared in a school by its educational community. By educational community, we mean teachers, family, administrations and services staff, and students. We talk about cultures and not culture because in each school, several cultures can coexist and they can be consistent or contradictory. Cultures are often reflected in institutional projects such as educational projects or documents referring to the vision, mission, and values of the school. School policies refer to the explicit and articulated planning of its norms, procedures, or actions, usually in the form of plans or programs. Examples would be student admission policies or policies related to the participation of educational community. Policies have their foundation in school cultures, and they may or may not be consistent with such cultures. For example, it is not uncommon to find schools that are explicitly defined as inclusive and democratic, but they follow authoritarian decision-making processes in relation to students with IDD. Last but not least, practices refer to the actions that are carried out daily by teachers and other professionals, both in the classroom and in other spaces or in complementary or extracurricular activities. Practices need policies that support them, and at the same time, practices are the way to embody the values and principles of a school's culture. This figure shows the relationship commented between these three relevant variables for monitoring inclusive education. Now it is time to focus on the next slide on how to monitor these three variables and what to do with the evidence gathered. From the perspective of the Index for Inclusion, for a school to successfully move towards inclusion, it must align inclusive culture, policies, and practice. The point is how to move towards inclusive culture, policies, and practices. To answer this question, we must split it into two specific questions: how to monitor them and what to do with the evidence obtained through the monitoring processes. The Index for Inclusion offers a set of resources and guidelines for action for those schools interested in advancing the inclusion of all students. Once we have defined these three elements, culture, policies, and practice, it is time to address the process of school improvement proposed by this instrument to include diverse learners, as those with intellectual disabilities. It is in this ongoing improvement process in which we have to understand the indicators to monitor culture, policies, and practices, and how to use the evidence gathered to support the changes that enhance and aim these three variables towards inclusion. The improvement plan that incorporates the index begins when each school considers how to better include all their learners, no matter their social or personal conditions. This is the first step towards inclusive education. The explicit recognition of the need to improve as a school to respond to diversity. This improvement plan, therefore, is based on the formative self-assessment of each school to advance in the path to inclusion. The following figure shows the improvement process described subsequently that the Index for Inclusion facilitates. In the phase number 1, the members of the educational community, not necessarily the teachers, propose the need to improve the level of inclusion of their school. In this phase, it is necessary to create a planning team that represents the main stakeholders of the educational community. In addition, it is necessary to include what Booth and Ainscow call a critical friend. This person is usually someone from outside the school who has experience in using the index for inclusion. This friend can facilitate access to the materials, help to understand the essential concepts of the tool, support the planning team for a better understanding of the evidence they are gathering, and help things change. Although phase 1 represents the beginning of the implementation of the Index for Inclusion, is in this phase when we should start to gather evidence about the processes carried out by our school to include the students. To this end, the Index for Inclusion collects a set of indicators and questions to monitor and gather evidence on the extent to which the own culture policies and practices that we are currently implemented present barriers to learning and participation of diverse learners. For each variable, the Index for Inclusion establishes 2 essential domains, which are specified through indicators that are in turn developed in operational questions to guide the shared reflection of the planning team on the own culture policies and practices. Since the indicators and questions are very exhaustive, it is essential that the planning team starts with a first contact to understand the indicators and questions. This is necessary to gain an understanding of the materials and to avoid falling into discouragement. Not all indicators must be used, and each planning team can decide where to start. As soon as the planning team has become familiar with the basic concepts and materials, it is necessary to begin exploring the school's priorities to improve the inclusion of the diverse learners. Indicators and questions can guide and help in this task. The following tables show examples of the domains, indicators, and exemplary questions for monitoring culture, policies, and practices that help in the task to identify barriers to learning and participation. The use of the indicators and questions is essential to build and feed the improvement plan. They allow to know the real needs of our school regarding each variable from which it will be necessary to start working for including diverse learners. In this case, I mean again, students with IDD. In the specification of the improvement plan, it is essential to investigate the feelings of all the planning team members as well as to make explicit their beliefs and views so that everyone gets involved with the improvement plan. This is a process of discovering together. Now we start phase 2, in which it is important to check everybody's understanding about the materials, the indicators, and all the improvement plan to be developed. Once the plan is explicitly elaborated through phase number 3, specifying priorities in short, medium, and long-term goals is essential to translate the plan into a set of actions and to facilitate the maintenance of the agreed actions. As a continuous process, it is essential to review the progress being made in the goals, reinforcing the progress of the school, reflecting the processes taken, and readjusting the priorities by defining new goals. In short, the indicators are useful to monitor and guide the reflections of the planning team and help in the task of defining new goals. Okay, then if we have this super tool, why to adopt a quality of life framework to monitor inclusive education? Perspective, such as those included in the Index for Inclusion, put the emphasis on monitoring current processes, culture policies, and practices to learn from what we are doing now to support the students' access, participation, and learning. This perspective, although widely known and used in the international sphere, lacks 2 relevant aspects. First, it focuses mainly on processes, the current actions that we are implementing in our school, but it does not put such focus on the monitoring the actual outcomes that we are achieving or not through these processes that we are putting into actions in our students with intellectual disabilities. Second, the monitoring is used to support access, participation, and learning, while it does not focus clearly on the goal of the development of students with IDD to their fullest potential. To include these 2 elements in monitoring, one perspective that is gaining weight in the international arena is the quality of life model developed by Schalock and Verdugo. This model defines quality of life as a state of personal well-being that is multidimensional and considers 8 domains in the student's life: emotional well-being, physical well-being, material well-being, personal development, self-determination, social inclusion, interpersonal relations, and rights. Second, has universal and cultural properties, is influenced by personal and environmental factors, as well as by the interaction between them, and finally, incorporates objective and subjective elements. Talking about quality of life in education means to put the focus on the student and the global domains that make up his or her life, thus going beyond academic achievement, from which to understand the student's aspirations and needs, to define programs and planning supports aimed at improving the student's personal outcomes in each one of the aforementioned domains. In other words, talking about quality of life in education means to shift the focus towards a whole child approach and to generate personal desired outcomes in all the areas composing the student's life. And what does the quality of life model bring for monitoring purposes? The model offers a monitoring and measurement framework validated by research. Reached this point, it is necessary to understand what we mean when we talk about universal and cultural properties. The domains that you can see in the slide are universal. That is, the areas that constitute a life of quality are the same for all people. For example, for a person with a physical disability living in Africa, the domains that constitute his or her quality of life are the same than for a person without a disability living in Europe. However, domains are conceptual. They are not observable nor measurable. Thus, it is necessary to put them into action to find what is indicative of each domain. In this sense, each domain is developed through observable and measurable indicators that constitute behaviors, perceptions, and conditions of each domain. While the domains are universal, the indicators are linked to culture and to the characteristics of individuals living in such cultures. So, retaking the previous example, what is indicative of emotional well-being of a person with a disability living in Africa probably will be different from what constitutes the emotional well-being for a person without a disability living in Europe, although for both of them, emotional well-being is important. In this sense, to monitor inclusive education through this model, it is necessary to develop a set of indicators relevant for the group of students with intellectual disability attending to schools. Working with the core indicators of the domains is critical, since the research has shown that the indicators of the domain are sensitive to the goals of the UNCRPD's article. Regarding Article 24, different authors suggest relationships between its goals and the quality of life domains. Therefore, the rights domain is related to the goal of access. Social inclusion and interpersonal relation domains are related to the goal of participation. Self-determination and personal development domains are related to learning, and emotional well-being, physical well-being, material well-being, and self-determination and personal development relate to the development of students with disabilities to their fullest potential. On the other hand, recent research is showing that emotional well-being, physical well-being, and personal development are transversal domains that contribute to all the four goals and to have students ready for transition processes. But now, how to use quality of life framework to monitor inclusive education? The quality of life model offers a framework to gather evidence and encourage reflection on students' personal outcomes in the 8 quality of life domains, which, as explained through their indicators, are sensitive to the goals of Article 24. This framework allows enriching the reflection-based monitoring of inclusive education, complementing and completing the one presented regarding the Index for Inclusion. The quality of life model, instead of putting the focus of reflection on the current processes mobilized by the school through its culture, policies, and practices, focuses on the personal outcomes that these processes are achieving, or that at least should be considering in students with IDD. Following a formative assessment, the evidence gathered through these reflections should be used to support decision-making for an ongoing improvement of schools' culture, policies, and practices, but always bearing in mind the aspiration, needs, and experiences of students with IDD in the 8 QoL domains related to the 4 goals of inclusive education. As you can see, this reflection process goes a step beyond of that provided by the Index for Inclusion. The point is that monitoring inclusive education through the quality of life indicators can follow a quantitative or a qualitative approach. Both approaches serve the purposes outlined above, although it is necessary to know what they imply in order to know which one to use. The most desirable would be to follow a quantitative approach. The quantitative approach, also called a standardized approach, requires designing, developing, and validating specific instruments aimed at the measurement of personal outcomes in a target population, students with IDD in this case. Through this approach, it is not only possible to drive the aforementioned reflection process, but it is also possible to develop standardized assessment instruments with evidence of validity and reliability. Through these types of instruments, we can evaluate the real impact that cultures, policies, and practices have on the life outcomes of students with IDD and use the evidence gathered to improve our culture, policies, and practices in a given school or community. However, adopting a standardized or quantitative approach is quite time and resource consuming, being necessary at least between 2 or 3 years of hard work. An alternative approach is a qualitative approach. From this approach, it is possible to develop items as a way of defining a student's needs, aspiration, and experiences relevant for the QoL indicators of each domain. These items can be used to delimit key areas from which to support the reflection on the school's culture, policies, and practices in the same way as is done in the Index for Inclusion. In this case, the items bring new into the monitoring processes the identification of the barriers that the school's current culture, policies, and practices have in enhancing student personal outcomes, always considering the whole child approach related to the 4 goals of inclusive education. For this purpose, in another Erasmus Plus project that was previously introduced by ASEL, that we have shared with our partners from Mira Sintra, we have developed 3 quality of life indexes with specific items regarding different educational stages as a way to define the needs, aspirations, and goals of students with IDD attending to elementary education from 3 to 6 years old, primary education from 6 to 12 years old, and secondary education from 12 to 18 years old. Please note that the rationale for this is that the context of each educational stage is different, so the indicators reflecting the aspirations and needs must also change. In that project, given the lack of time for proper validation, we have focused only in the qualitative approach. And now I will present the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education primary education version as an example because it's the version of the instrument that we have started to validate in Spain. The goal of the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education primary education version is to provide schools with a set of items to guide their reflections on the extent to which their cultures, practices, and policies are focused on the whole development of their students with IDD, something consistent with the Article 24 of the UNCRPD. Hence, this tool is intended to help schools in monitoring their current culture, policies, and practices towards the identification of barriers that hinder the development of their students with IDD to their fullest potential. Through reflection processes based on the items provided, schools can monitor and gather evidence on the barriers and strengths they have to build and develop improvement plans and strategies to update their practices, culture, and policies, bearing in mind key areas to enhance the development of students with IDD. Information on the barriers and the strengths can be prioritized for each domain, and a specific change plan can be jointly created to take an action and make things happen. By enhancing students' outcomes in all the quality of life domains, schools are contributing not only to the development of their students with IDD, but also to other areas such as access, participation, and learning. Then, of course, it is necessary an ongoing feedback to keep the changes adopted and to detect new barriers and keep adapting to the reality. As you can see in the figure, the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education starts with a justification on what a quality of life approach can bring for monitoring inclusive education. And then the steps that the school can follow are presented. As this table shows, the process followed is the same than for the Index for Inclusion. We even propose its use along with the Index for Inclusion to strengthen the reflection guided by the index by focusing also on outcomes and in all the inclusive education goals. Each stage has a series of tips and specific annexes with examples of a specific task to do at each stage. Let's gonna see the different annexes with the applied and practical information. The Annex number 1 is intended to help the users to define a change group composed by relevant stakeholders from the school community. We provide an example of Annex 1 already filled to give ideas to the school that are starting to work with the school. And then we give a completely black template so that they can start working with the examples that we are providing. Annex number 2 reflects a group task. As a group, it is necessary to discuss and make explicit the school's cultures, policies, and practices, as well as the mission, vision, and values. Annex number 3 refers to an individual task, bearing in mind the mission, vision, and values that the school as a group have made explicit, and thinking in terms of the school's culture, policies, and practices. It is necessary that each participant makes an individual reflection on the extent to which the school's culture, policies, and practices are focused to achieve personal outcomes in students with IDD. The items will be the glasses that each participant will wear during the reflection process. In other words, although each one is going to use the items to guide the reflection must be placed on how the school's culture, policies, and practices contribute to the achievement of the personal outcome described in the items. The information that each group member gathers through this monitoring exercise will allow that participant to identify the school's barriers for improvement purposes. Annex 4 is another individual task. In this case, it consists in identifying, based on the previous reflection, the barriers or difficulties and the opportunities and resources that each one finds regarding the school's culture, policies, and practices to enhance the students' personal outcomes. We have made a brief space to identify a couple of difficulties and strengths per quality of life domain. Annex number 5. Once the individual assessment is completed, it is time for the team to sit and talk to put together the individual reflection. Now it is time to prioritize those barriers for the domain that the group feels that is threatened the most according to the assessment of the school's culture, policies, and practices. A good way to make this prioritization would be to reach an agreement based on the same or similar barriers detected consistently by the team members in the individual assessment. Reached this point, it is necessary to start thinking about a specific plan to address the most pressing barrier and transform it into a facilitator for students' development. In this sense, the prioritization should address specific goals to increase the chances of success. Bearing this in mind, it is necessary to identify around 3 priorities to start working, one for the cultures, one for the policies, and one for the practices. And it is important then to accept that there will be probably more than one priority, but the team needs to be patient and saves its energies because inclusion is an ongoing process and the other barriers can be addressed at a different moment. This annex provides the team with tables where the team can both identify the most pressing need to address and the specific improvement plan. Focus on improving the quality of life of students. The annex provides 3 planning sheets, one for cultures, one for policies, and one for practices. The main limitation of this tool is that it is a qualitative approach, so it is not possible to know if the changes accomplished really produce a change in students' outcomes or not. But as I said, this can be considered as a first step in developing a quantitative approach. In fact, this is what we are currently doing in Spain. And now it's time for Professor Verdugo to introduce you the research that he is leading now to validate this index, the version for primary education in Spain.
Thank you, Antonio. Can you move the slides, please?
Yes, of course.
Okay. It's good to speak after Antonio because he has explained everything, but I will briefly explain what we are doing now as a continuation of the European project. Then we already advanced and we already sent even a manuscript for publication titled Core Indicators to assess quality of life in students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We already we already identify in that manuscript, we describe the identification of evidence we have on content validity of some aspect of indicators that have been developed by the research team and a Delphi study, exhaustively done and developed. And this is the first step. After the Delphi study, the qualitative approach, we will develop we are already starting to apply an experimental study to get the final tool after 1 or 2 years, that then we'll use freely for anybody that have interest in that. No, then what is the methodology and research that we have? Well, we started with the systematic review of literature and the systematic review of the tools or instruments already done and published by other researchers in the world. After this analysis of the research team, we start a discussion with 30 direct practice professionals and 6 researchers about the appropriateness of the items we selected, if they pertain or not to the domains that we started to include. And this is for previous, this phase or this step was previous to the development of a Delphi study that we can see in the next slide. In this Delphi study, we have 4 rounds. We were 6 months working with 14 experts on disabilities and on quality of life. And then the 14 experts assess, propose items, review items. We asked them several tasks, even repeated, to get the consensus. That is the focus of the Delphi study. And we were refining the first database that the research team developed. And at the end, we have like 157 items. But our idea was to obtain or to at least 12 items for each domain, the 8 domains that you already know and Antonio explained before. Then in the next slide, Antonio. Okay, you have examples of the 96 items, 12 for each domain that we already developed. No, is what the experts or what research already done emphasize. No, and then this is what we have done. They are one of the criteria we use to develop these items or to refine or to conclude that were appropriate was that they can be observed by others. They represent an important issue in the inclusion, in the educational inclusion in primary school. Different criteria we use to get to this point. No? And well, if we go to the last slide that we have 3 different ideas that reflects the consensus of that we have done in the world. These are the key messages of the project and our participation in the European Union project. The first is that we have developed an evidence-based approach to develop a conceptual and framework that can help schools to focus on key vital areas related to the 4 goals that Antonio stressed, like access, participation, learning and development. And then we have now the framework of quality of life from an applied and consensus work. No? These we think that are important to facilitate the personal well-being of students in schools and to facilitate the work of professionals of education in enhancing the quality of life of students. No? Then the second point is that we already have 3 different quality of life indexes, primary and secondary, and then the previous to primary school too. And then although we concentrate on the research now on primary school, we also plan to develop a quality of life index for secondary students, thinking on the self-determination and other skills that are related directly to the success in employment and in adult life. No, then we are committed to do this after finishing the first instrument, and also we will publish openly the instrument and will facilitate translation and adaptation to other countries, like we have done in the previous different quality of life instruments we developed, that already some of that instruments are translated and adapted to 11 or 9 languages. Then the last point is related to this connection between the work we have done and the adult life. No, education is important because we try to help people to be prepared to have success in adult life. Then the quality of life approach just think on different areas related to the success in life when you can take decisions by yourself, when the people or a person with intellectual disability can do that. And that's it. I think our presentation, we are ready to answer your questions or comments or critiques that you consider appropriate to ask to Antonio and me.
Asel, we can't hear you, I think.
Oh, okay. Great, thank you for letting me know. I was just thanking both of our speakers, Miguel and Antonio. Thanks a lot for this comprehensive presentation that you have prepared. I would like maybe Antonio, if you could stop sharing the presentation so we can have an overview of all the participants that we have in this session. Thanks again. I think it was quite clear and a lot of information. Just want to let you know that on the conference platform in the agenda, if you go to the workshop, you will find a lot of materials from the IEE Plus project. So you can have a look at many of those materials that were in the presentation. They are also there. So please feel free to use it. That's the great part of Erasmus Plus projects that develop a lot of materials that can be shared openly. So please do not use that opportunity. As our speakers have mentioned, we open the floor for questions, and while you're maybe thinking about some questions you might have, I can start by just a second. Maybe let me see. So there is a question, when will it be available? So the materials are already available, but perhaps for the rest of the studies, our speakers can come in here.
Okay. Yes, I mean, who answers, Miguel?
You, don't worry.
Okay. Diana, the materials in the English version following this qualitative approach that I have explained at the end of my intervention, I think they are already available. But the point is that now we are adapting it and making the translation in Spain. And I think that by the end of 2022, it will be perfectly validated in Spain. So if you are working in Spain, maybe for the surname, it seems, but if you are working in Spain, I think it would be better, okay, Portugal. Well, the point is that for those working in Spain, I think that it should be better if they use the version adapted and validated in Spain, because the indicators are specific to the context. So in that sense, it would be preferably if they use the validated index in Spain. The quantitative index can be used for the both approaches. For the qualitative approach to drive the reflection, as I have explained, and also to measure the quality of life outcomes for students, to drive interventions and to see the extent to which we have improved the outcome. So the standardized version at the end of 2022, the qualitative version, I think it is already available.
Okay, yeah, yes, Diana, you can see I include in the URL to to obtain different tools that we already developed on quality of life. Some of them have been already translated and adapted to Portuguese. Probably you know, but anything we will publish in the future will be here and free to use. These are just these pages for all the 11 or 12 tools that already have been developed from 10 years ago. But anything, you can contact us and we can speak about
that. Thank you for this full answer. While maybe there are any other questions. Oh, I see Karin raised her hand. Please, Karin.
Thank you, Azel. Miguel and Antonio, thank you very much for this very comprehensive information. I really liked your approach. I've been working with quality of life instruments with adult services for persons with learning disabilities. And I was wondering the scale you're currently developing, do you intend to formulate it for self-assessment by the students or is it assessed by other people? How will it look like? Could you give me a better idea? Thank you.
Well, I think that although these instruments are focusing on intellectually disabled people, you know that we are intellectually and developmentally disabled. Most of them can be used by people with learning disabilities, significant learning disabilities, probably minority groups of cultural immigrants or minority groups, because the model and the framework of assessment is very appropriate for this, also for these groups of people. No? But for validation, we should concentrate only in the intellectual and developmentally disabled groups. We have been working usually with, because the items are especially obtained thinking on that students. But is useful for more people, and different organizations in Spain use the work that we have done with also with other students with adaptive problems or immigrants or other kinds of behavioral problems too. No? But you should think always that the standardization is with intellectually and developmentally disabled.
And another thing that I would like to add is that perhaps I didn't talk about it in the presentation, is that this the quality of life index in the version that we are developing right now is focused on a report of others approach. But when we are talking about secondary education with the self-determination, with the transition processes, we are trying, or we want to develop both a report of other and a self-report version too, because self-determination is very important in that stage, and it's important to give a voice to them. And we are going to complement also with focus groups, including family and students. But the point is that COVID-19 broke also our projection of the research. Unfortunately, we had a tremendous lockdown and we had to adapt. But we are considering, of course, we will undertake this alternative, especially putting the emphasis in secondary and transition processes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm very interested to have a look at that once you're ready. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I also have a question from Lydia. Lydia, if you could unmute yourself and quickly introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Lydia, and I'm coming from Macedonia, the Republic of North Macedonia now recently. Through my organization Open the Windows, we are a member in ESPD, and really glad to be here and to speak about inclusive education, something that is very, how to say, process in the moment in our country. I would like to ask a question about the quality of life, something that I need much more information, having in mind that In our country, just 2 years ago, the new law for elementary education is really inclusive, and it's in the line with the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we have lots of measures and support services and everything which the convention call on. We have functional assessment of a person with students with disabilities, not anymore medical approach, etc. So we are now for the first time this year implementing the additional support measures in the mainstream schools for students with disabilities. So my question is, after how long, after how many years we should try to develop these quality indicators in order to measure the implementation of inclusion, or how we implement, what are the results of inclusive measures that we implement in the practice. I mean, I am sure that if we start now, we will have lots of no or lots of not implemented, not existing indicators. So I'm looking for the answer from other participants. As I said, how long should we go through the practice with this new law and new measures, and then to start to think to put in practice and to these indicators, and to propose to the schools that they have to, however, to measure this result. That is one my question. And the second one is, for me, is kind of confusing that this quality of life indicators are only for person with intellectual disabilities. Then it seems like we have to have another indicators for example, children with autism or children with sensorial impairments. I mean, I'm personally confused. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the questions, and I think it is great news that the EASPD is making more networks and alliances to enhance the inclusive education opportunities to all the students. And about the questions, well, as you said, you are opening now to these inclusion processes, and okay, quality of life is a framework that can shed lights on inclusive education process, but inclusive education also must takes into consideration a rights approach, a social ecological approach, or a supports paradigm to understand the support needs of students as a mismatch between their personal competencies and environmental demands. And then we have a quality of life approach that highlights the personal outcomes. So about how long you have to wait until you start to implement this quality of life approach, or to measure personal outcomes. Well, I think there is no a time frame, a basic or a specific time frame, given that the indicators that, for example, we have developed in the IE Plus project is just to help schools to make an initial reflection about the key areas of the student to consider in the education process. So if you are now starting to work with inclusive education approaches, I think it is even now a good moment to include this quality of life now that you are starting, rather than waiting to have a different approach and then ask people to change. So this is a resource that can be used to support the new practices and approaches that you are now developing in the country, and it's another way to complement what you are already doing. So it is not a matter of we have to measure outcomes. No, it is a matter of putting the focus of our actions and processes on the key aspirations and needs of students that we should be considering in light of the United Nations Convention. It is not only a matter of functional assessment, assessment of competencies, assessment of support needs, or implementation of supports. It is also a matter of, okay, what kind of outcomes should I achieve in my students? Only access, participation, and learning? Or should I focus also in an extra element, which is development of my students to the fullest potential? This is the main applied value that a quality of life approach brings to education. And the indicators is a way to help you focus in this extra element. And about the adaptation to other personal or social conditions, which is a critical element, because if we are talking about inclusive education involves all students, migrant people, LGBTI people, also people who come from another minorities like Roma children or Gypsy people, and of course people with different disabilities. Inclusive education concerns all. But the point is that if we look into the structure of the quality of life models, we have domains and we have indicators. The indicators are sensitive to specific groups. So these indicators, although can be validated and used with other group of students, should be preferably used with students with intellectual and developmental disability, autism, cerebral palsy, X-fragile syndrome, alcoholic fetal spectrum syndrome, and of course, Down syndrome students. These indicators are mainly focused on those students, but you can, of course, use it to support reflection processes. In the future, maybe we can develop another indicators to students with another kind of conditions, because the nature of the indicator is that they are specific to the characteristics of the group and environments where the students work and participate. So this is my answer. I'm sorry that I talk a lot, but
No, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Antonio.
Antonio. Yeah, it was really useful and practical, and now it's raising lots of more questions for myself. But I'm sure that I can find these 2 days to chat directly with you, so we can just share much more information if it is okay for you.
yes, I just wrote my email.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to see that there are these connections being made. Also, do not forget that there is the conference app where you can connect to different speakers and other participants of the conference. So please do use it. I would like to wrap up because we are coming to an end of this session. Thank you very much. It was personally, I learned a lot. So I hope you have the same feeling. I would like to ask you to use the reactions button to give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. For ESPD, it's very important to be connected to researchers and academia. And I'm really happy that Miguel is part of our Eureka network. So I hope in the future we'll continue working and putting service providers in touch with what is happening in research and academia. I would also like to thank all the participants and everyone who was involved in this session. So Adriana for being our technical support, and Maxime for taking notes, and of course the captioners who are working very hard trying to capture everything that was said. Thank you very much. And maybe the last thing is we will share a quick video that will show you some beautiful scenery, but also the program for tomorrow. So do not miss the opportunity to join us tomorrow. We will start at, I at 9:30 tomorrow morning with another energizer session, and we'll have 2 panel sessions on lifelong learning and VET, and the session B is on supporting the development of social service workforce through education and training. And at 11:30 we will start with a panel session to inclusive education and beyond, developing EU policies for inclusive education. I hope you will join us tomorrow. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Bye bye. Obrigada.
Bye.